Have you ever wondered what life was truly like in a time long past, a world where the very concept of you was entirely different? What if your name, your identity, even your belongings, ceased to be truly yours the moment you said, "I do"? In 1420, this wasn't a hypothetical question, it was the stark reality for countless women. Prepare to delve into the astonishing legal landscape where husbands held incredible power over their wives' wealth and possessions. Number 1. Wills and bequests, her last wishes subject to his will. Imagine a world where your final wishes, those heartfelt desires about what happens to your cherished possessions after you're gone, could be completely overridden, not by legal argument, but by the simple fact of your marriage. In 1420 England, this was the deeply entrenched reality for married women, a concept that feels utterly foreign to our modern understanding of personal autonomy. The husband's power over his wife's property extended even beyond the grave, dictating what she could or could not bequeath in a will. This wasn't just about the absence of a right, it was about the fundamental legal doctrine that swallowed her independent existence whole. Let's journey back to the English countryside of 1420. Picture a woman named Isolde. Before she married her husband, Thomas, Isolde was what the law called a femme sole, a single woman. As a femme sole, Isolde had a surprising amount of legal freedom. She could own land, she could engage in business, and yes, she could write a will, formally called a testament, for personal property and a devise for real property, to decide who would inherit her worldly goods. She could leave her brooch to her sister, her small plot of land to her favored niece, or even a modest sum of money to the local church. Her intentions, clearly articulated in a written document witnessed by respected members of her community, carried legal weight. The moment Isolde spoke her vows and became Isolde, wife of Thomas, her legal world shifted dramatically, as if a great, unseen curtain had fallen. She transitioned from femme sole to femme covert, a covered woman, shielded and, crucially, controlled by her husband. Under the common law of England at the time, her legal identity merged with his. This wasn't merely a social custom, it was a foundational principle of the legal system, as described in texts from the period that would eventually form the basis of English common law. And this legal merger had profound implications for her ability to create a valid will. Personal property, which included things like household goods, money, jewelry, clothing, and animals, the situation was starkly simple. Upon marriage, all of Isolde's personal property automatically became Thomas's property. He owned it outright. It wasn't a shared ownership, it was his. This meant that Isolde could not, under any circumstances, make a will to dispose of her personal property because it wasn't hers to begin with. It belonged to Thomas. Any attempt she made to bequeath her grandmother's silver spoons or her best kirtle would be legally void. Thomas could sell them, give them away, or leave them in his own will, and Isolde had no say in the matter. This fundamental aspect of common law, widely acknowledged by legal commentators throughout the medieval period, meant that a married woman's personal wealth simply vanished into her husband's control, leaving her nothing of her own to devise. Now, consider real property, land, and buildings. This was a little more nuanced, but still very much under the husband's shadow. As we've explored earlier, while a married woman, a femme covert, might retain titular ownership of her premarital land, her husband gained the right to manage it, collect its profits, and control its use throughout his lifetime. He couldn't usually sell it without her consent, but her consent was often a formality, extracted through a legal process known as fine and recovery, which, while theoretically protecting her, was often a tool for her husband's agenda. When it came to her ability to make a will concerning this land, the common law was quite firm. Generally, a married woman could not devise real property in her will without her husband's express consent. And even with his consent, the process was complicated and often legally precarious. The reasoning was, again, rooted in the concept of coverture. Her legal identity was subsumed by her husband's, and she could not act independently in matters of property, especially concerning land, which was the bedrock of wealth and power in feudal society. To allow a wife to freely devise her land would undermine the husband's control over the marital estate and potentially disinherit his male heirs. Legal documents from the 15th century, such as those discussed in works on medieval land law, illustrate this rigid restriction. Imagine Isolde nearing the end of her life, perhaps with a family heirloom, a small cottage she inherited from her mother, that that she desperately wished to pass to her unmarried sister, who was in need. Under the law, she could not simply write this down in her will. For such a bequest to have any chance of being legally recognized, it would require Thomas's explicit agreement, and even then, it might need to be structured through complex legal mechanisms, such as a use, which was a precursor to a trust. Even if Thomas agreed, he might impose conditions, or simply change his mind, leaving Isolde's wishes unfulfilled. This wasn't merely a matter of social etiquette or family agreement. It was a legal constraint, rigorously enforced by the courts and the norms of the time. Consider the practical implications of this. Dying wife, perhaps heartbroken that she could not provide for a younger sibling or a beloved relative through her own inherited means, would have to rely entirely on her husband's goodwill. He was ungenerous or had other plans for the property. Her desires were simply irrelevant in the eyes of the law. Her autonomy in this final act of self-determination was almost entirely absent. The only glimmer of independence came if she outlived her husband, thus reverting to femme sole status, or if specific arrangements had been made through a prenuptial agreement, which were rare and often only for very wealthy families, or through complex trusts designed to circumvent common law. Even in these rare instances, the default legal position was clear. Her will, concerning her property, was not truly hers to make. The husband's shadow stretched over her even onto her deathbed, ensuring that his legal control over her property remained absolute or paramount until her very last breath. This enduring legal power underscores how deeply embedded the husband's authority was in the fabric of 1420 society, shaping not just daily life, but even the afterlife of a woman's possessions. Number 2, legal representation. He was her voice, her shield, her hand in court. In 1420, stepping into a courtroom was an intimidating prospect for anyone, but for a married woman, it was almost an impossibility. The law simply did not recognize her as an independent entity capable of bringing a lawsuit or defending herself against one. Her legal existence, as we have seen, was subsumed by her husband. This meant that if a married woman's property was disputed, if someone owed her money, or if she was accused of a financial wrongdoing, it was her husband who had to act on her behalf. He was her voice, her shield, her hand in court, and this gave him immense power over any property she might possess or acquire. Imagine a situation where a liener, a married woman, had a dispute with a local merchant over a payment. Perhaps the merchant had promised to deliver a certain quantity of grain in exchange for a sum of money she had contributed from her own premarital savings, and he failed to uphold his end of the agreement. In today's world, a liener would simply hire a lawyer or represent herself and take the merchant to court. But in 1420, a liener could not do this. She could not initiate a lawsuit in her own name. The legal principle of coverture dictated that her husband, Robert, must be the one to bring the action. The case would be filed as Robert and a liener, his wife versus the merchant, but Robert would be the primary actor, making the decisions, engaging with the legal process, and ultimately controlling the outcome. This was not a mere formality. It had profound practical implications. What if a liener believed strongly that she had been wronged, but Robert did not? Perhaps Robert was friends with the merchant, or perhaps he simply didn't see the dispute as worth the effort and expense of legal action. In such a scenario, a liener had no recourse. She could not force her husband to sue, and she could not sue independently. Her grievance and the potential recovery of her property or money simply withered away, lost in the legal void created by her lack of independent standing. Legal treatises from the period and court records confirm that actions concerning a married woman's property almost always involved her husband as the named plaintiff or defendant. Conversely, if a married woman was accused of a financial misdeed, or if a debt she incurred before marriage came to light, her husband was also the one who had to respond in court. For instance, if a liener had borrowed money before she married Robert, and the creditor came seeking repayment after her marriage, the lawsuit would be brought against Robert and a liener, his wife. Robert would be legally responsible for her premarital debts. This responsibility, while a burden, also gave him a direct interest in controlling her finances, both before and after marriage. He would need to manage the defense, perhaps drawing upon her remaining assets, which were now his, to settle the claim. This intertwined legal liability further cemented his control over her property. The implications extended beyond simple debt collection or contract disputes. Consider disputes over land. While a married woman might nominally retain ownership of land she brought into the marriage, her husband had the right to manage it. If a neighbor encroached upon her land, or if there was a dispute over boundaries or feudal obligations, it was Robert who would represent their joint interest in court. He would argue the case, present evidence, and negotiate settlements. His legal prowess, or lack thereof, directly impacted the security and value of Alina's inherited property. It could, through a bad legal decision or a compromise, diminish the value of her estate, and she would have little to no power to prevent it. Legal records from manorial courts and royal courts of the 15th century frequently show husbands acting on behalf of their wives in property disputes, underscoring this legal reality. This lack of independent legal standing also meant that a married woman could not make binding contracts on her own. If she tried to sell a piece of land, even land she nominally owned, without her husband's explicit involvement and approval, the contract would likely be deemed invalid. If she attempted to enter into a business agreement, her husband's consent and participation were typically essential for its legal enforceability. This further limited her economic agency and ensured that any significant financial transaction involving her property was always subject to her husband's oversight and ultimate decision. Legal historians describe how this restriction on contracting ability was a direct consequence of coverture, making it impossible for a married woman to independently manage or dispose of assets. Even in cases where a married woman might have had personal access to some funds, perhaps through a small allowance or a secret inheritance, she could not enforce her rights to these funds through legal means if her husband chose to interfere. For example, a distant relative left Alina a small sum of money in a will, and her husband appropriated it. She could not sue him for its return. The very concept of suing her husband was, with very few and specific exceptions, like severe physical abuse, almost unimaginable under 1420 common law because they were legally one person. This inherent unity meant internal disputes over property were largely settled outside the formal legal system, usually through social pressure or the husband's discretion. The only way a married woman could potentially gain some limited legal representation separate from her husband was in very specific, often tragic, circumstances, such as cases of marital separation, or, in extreme cases, through the intervention of the ecclesiastical courts for spiritual matters, though even these often had limited power over property rights. Even then, her legal standing was precarious and heavily dependent on the specific circumstances and the willingness of others to intervene. General rule remained unyielding. In the eyes of the common law courts of 1420, a married woman's legal voice was her husband's, and his control over her property was powerfully reinforced by his exclusive right to represent her in all legal and financial matters. This was not a minor inconvenience. It was a fundamental denial of her legal personhood, ensuring that all her property remained firmly within his sphere of influence. Number 3, earnings and gifts. Every penny she made, every gift she received was his. Imagine working tirelessly, perhaps spinning wool, baking bread, or helping in the family fields, only to have every penny you earned, every small gain, automatically become the property of your husband. Or imagine receiving a cherished gift, a piece of jewelry from a beloved aunt, or a small sum of money from a grateful neighbor, only for that gift to legally belong to your husband the instant it touched your hands. In 1420 England, this was not just a possibility, it was the default legal position for every married woman. Any income she generated, and any gifts she received, became the absolute property of her husband, further solidifying his total control over their household's finances and her individual economic potential. Let's think about Agnes, a miller's wife in a bustling village. Agnes was a skilled baker, renowned for her delicious loaves and pastry. She would often bake extra batches and sell them at the local market, perhaps earning a few shillings each week. In a modern context, those earnings would be hers to save, to spend, or to invest as she saw fit. But in 1420, the moment that silver shilling exchanged hands and came into Agnes's possession, it legally ceased to be hers. It became the property of her husband, John. This wasn't merely a social convention where he managed the household funds. It was a strict legal principle of common law. The doctrine of coverture meant that her earnings were an extension of his economic activities, and thus legally his. Legal texts from the era, as discussed by scholars of medieval economic life, confirm this outright appropriation of a wife's earnings. This applied not just to direct monetary earnings, but also to any other form of economic benefit she might create. Agnes raised chickens and sold their eggs. The income from the eggs belonged to John. If she wove cloth, the profit from its sale was his. Her labor, her skill, her enterprise, all of it directly contributed to her husband's wealth, without her retaining any legal claim to the fruits of her own work. This created a profound economic dependency. Agnes could not, for example, save money in secret to buy a small piece of land for her own future security or to provide for a needy relative. Any savings she accumulated, even through her own hard work, legally belonged to John and could be used by him for any purpose, without her consent. The same principle applied to gifts. Let's consider Mary, a young wife who inherited a small plot of land or a valuable piece of jewelry from a dying relative. In a different legal system, this inheritance would be hers alone, to manage and enjoy. But in 1420, upon receiving the gift or inheritance, it immediately fell under her husband's control. If it was personal property, like the jewelry, it became his outright. He could sell it, pawn it, or give it away. Mary would have no legal recourse, no claim to what was once intended as a personal legacy for her. If it was real property, like the land, her husband would gain the use, profits, and management of it for his lifetime, effectively absorbing it into his estate, even if the nominal ownership remained in her name for future inheritance purposes, if she outlived him or had children. Legal scholars like Sir William Blackstone, though writing much later, codified these common law principles, which were already firmly in place in the 15th century, explaining how gifts and inheritances to a wife instantly became subject to her husband's dominion. Imagine the emotional toll this would take. A woman might receive a gift of a finely wrought silver goblet, a family heirloom intended to pass down through generations of women in her family. The moment it was presented to her, her husband could claim it as his own. He could then choose to sell it to cover a debt, or simply because he preferred money over sentiment. The emotional connection, the family legacy, was legally irrelevant. Her husband's property rights superseded any personal attachment or familial intention. This forced women to often rely on the goodwill and generosity of their husbands for access to even the smallest personal funds or cherished items. If her husband was mean-spirited or financially reckless, she could find herself in a deeply vulnerable position, devoid of any personal wealth. There were very, very limited exceptions, mainly for very wealthy families who could afford complex legal arrangements. A use or a primitive form of trust could be set up by a third party to hold property to the use of a married woman, explicitly stating that it was not to fall under her husband's absolute control. This was a sophisticated legal maneuver, accessible only to the elite, and even then, its effectiveness could be challenged in courts. For the vast majority of ordinary women in 1420, such intricate legal protections were entirely out of reach. The default rule, rooted in the simplicity and bluntness of common law, was that all of a wife's earnings and all her gifts, whether monetary or material, merged with her husband's possessions and became his to command. This constant legal absorption of a wife's economic contributions and windfalls served to reinforce her subordinate position within the marriage and within society. It ensured that her financial independence was non-existent and that her husband remained the sole economic head of the household, with ultimate control over all acquired wealth. This was not just about money. It was about power, control, and the complete legal erasure of a married woman's individual economic agency in medieval England. It was a world where every shilling she earned, every gift she received, became just another testament to her husband's pervasive legal dominion. Number 4, tenancy by the courtesy, his post-mortem grasp on her inheritance. As if his control over her property during her lifetime wasn't enough, the legal system in 1420 England extended the husband's power beyond his wife's death, giving him a powerful claim to her inherited lands under a doctrine known as tenancy by the courtesy or courtesy of England. This was a significant and lasting form of control, ensuring that even after a wife passed away, her ancestral lands, those pieces of earth that had been in her family for generations, could remain firmly within her husband's grasp for the remainder of his life. Imagine Alara, a woman from a respected gentry family, who inherited a substantial estate, a manor house, fertile fields, and productive woodlands from her deceased father. When Alara married John, John gained the right to manage these lands and collect their profits during her lifetime, as we've discussed, but the legal implications went further. Alara and John had a child together, and that child was born alive and capable of inheriting Alara's land. A powerful new right for John was created. This right was called tenancy by the courtesy. The specific conditions for a husband to claim tenancy by the courtesy were quite precise. First, the wife had to be seized of an estate of inheritance. This means she had to possess land in fee simple, the highest form of ownership, essentially outright ownership, or fee tail ownership limited to specific heirs. This was not about temporary leases or life interests. It was about land that she could pass down through her lineage. Second, the marriage had to be a lawful one, producing legitimate heirs. Third, a child capable of inheriting the land from the wife had to be born alive. This was a crucial point. Even if the child lived only for a few moments, even if it later died, the mere fact of its live birth was enough to vest the husband's right to courtesy. This legal detail meant that countless families anxiously awaited the birth of a child, not just for joy, but for the profound legal implications it had for land ownership and control. Fourth, the wife had to die. Only upon her death did the husband's courtesy right become active, giving him a life estate in all of her lands of inheritance. So for Alara and John, once their child was born alive, John's potential right to courtesy was established. When Alara eventually passed away, perhaps due to childbirth complications or illness, John did not simply lose control of her ancestral lands. Instead, he gained a life estate in those lands. This meant that he could continue to manage the manor, collect all its rents and profits, make decisions about its agricultural output, and live there as if it were his own for the rest of his life. He could not sell the land outright, as it was destined for Alara's heirs, their children, but he had the beneficial use and management of it until his own death. Legal treatises on English common law from this period clearly delineate these rights, explaining how courtesy provided a husband with significant, long-term control over his deceased wife's ancestral estates. Consider the enormous power this gave John. Even after Alara was gone, her family's lands were effectively under his dominion. Children, the true heirs, would have to wait until their father's death, potentially decades later, to fully inherit what was rightfully theirs through their mother. This could create significant tensions within families, particularly if John remarried. His new wife and any children he had with her would benefit from the revenues of Alara's land, even though they had no blood claim to it. This was a common source of conflict in medieval society, as recorded in numerous family histories and property disputes from the era. The very purpose of courtesy was to ensure that a husband, who had provided an heir and managed the estate, was not left destitute or without means after his wife's death, particularly if her lands were the primary source of family wealth. The existence of tenancy by the courtesy also influenced how marriages were viewed and arranged, especially among the landed classes. A husband whose wife brought substantial inherited lands into the marriage had a strong incentive to ensure the birth of a living child. The child's existence unlocked this powerful right, securing his financial future even beyond his wife's lifespan. It underscores how deeply intertwined property, lineage, and marriage were in 1420. The law was designed to protect the interests of the male head of household, ensuring continuity of management and economic stability for him, even if it meant deferring the rightful inheritance of his children. Imagine a situation where Alara's brother, who was her direct male heir in the absence of a child, might have expected to inherit the land if Alara died without issue. But once a child was born, even if that child later died, John's courtesy right was secured. The brother would then have to wait for John to die before he or his heirs could claim the land, potentially pushing the inheritance much further down the line and disrupting the traditional transfer of property within the wife's original family. This was a significant legal barrier to the smooth transmission of female inherited property through the female line, placing a male relative, the husband, in a powerful intermediary position. Manorial roles and court pleas from the 15th century often detail disputes arising from such situations, highlighting the long-reaching effects of courtesy. This posthumous control highlights the pervasive nature of male legal dominance in 1420. Even in death, a married woman's property was not fully free to follow her intentions or the direct line of her family's descent. Her husband's legal claim, triggered by the birth of a child, provided him with a lasting stake in her inherited wealth, ensuring that her family's legacy remained within his sphere of influence for the remainder of his life. It was a remarkable legal privilege, cementing his power and financial security long after his wife had passed from this earthly realm, leaving her children to await their turn. Number 5. Chattels real, leaseholds at his command. Beyond outright ownership of personal items and the lifelong control over inherited lands, husbands in 1420 England wielded significant power over another crucial type of property, chattels real. This category sounds complicated, but it essentially refers to long-term leasehold interests in land, such as a lease for a fixed term of years. While not considered real property, in the same way as land held in fee simple, these leaseholds were incredibly valuable. They represented rights to use and profit from land for a significant period, and the husband's control over them was absolute. He could sell them, mortgage them, or assign them without his wife's consent, effectively treating them as his own personal wealth. Imagine a situation where Agnes, a married woman, possessed a valuable lease. Perhaps before her marriage, she inherited a leasehold on a productive farm for a term of 99 years, a common arrangement for valuable land in the 15th century. This lease granted her the right to farm the land, collect its produce, and profit from it for nearly a century. Such a lease was a significant asset, representing a steady stream of income and a substantial investment. The moment Agnes married Thomas, her husband, this valuable leasehold immediately came under his complete and undeniable control. Unlike her real property, which he controlled for life but could not typically sell without her very formal and often coerced consent, her chattels real were different. Thomas could sell that 99-year lease to another tenant, effectively transferring Agnes's long-term rights to someone else, and keep all the proceeds for himself. He could mortgage it, borrowing money against its value, placing a burden on the asset. He could assign it to a creditor to pay off a debt. He could even simply give it away to a friend or relative. All of these actions could be taken by Thomas without Agnes's permission or even her knowledge. This was a stark reality of common law, clearly stated in legal writings from the era, which classified leaseholds as a form of personal property for the purpose of the husband's control during marriage. Consider the implications for Agnes. The lease might have been her primary source of income, her security, or even her dream for her family's future. Yet, Thomas could extinguish that dream with a single transaction. If he was a gambler or simply a poor manager of money, he could dissipate the value of this significant asset, leaving Agnes and their children with nothing from her inheritance. There was no legal recourse for Agnes to stop him. The law simply considered these chattels real as personal property, albeit property tied to land, and therefore, upon marriage, they became his to dispose of as he saw fit. What happened if Thomas died before Agnes? In that specific scenario, the leasehold would typically revert to Agnes. It would not pass to Thomas's heir. This was one of the few instances where a married woman might regain control of property that had been under her husband's dominion. However, if Agnes died before Thomas, the leasehold would pass to Thomas's heirs, not hers. This legal nuance further solidified his control. He could dispose of it during his lifetime, and if he outlived her, it became part of his estate to be bequeathed as he wished. This was a powerful incentive for husbands to outlive their wives, as it meant retaining control of these valuable leaseholds. The distinction between chattels real and real property, freehold land, was subtle but critical in medieval law. Freehold land was associated with feudal tenure, long-term lineage, and complex inheritance rules, offering some protection to the wife's claim, even if the husband had use of it. Chattels real, however, were viewed more like movable goods, even though they were fixed to the land for a period. This classification allowed the husband far greater freedom to alienate, sell, or transfer them. This legal distinction was meticulously observed in medieval courts and is well documented in historical legal texts discussing property rights. Imagine the economic landscape of 1420, where access to land was paramount for survival and prosperity. A long-term lease could be the backbone of a family's livelihood. A woman who brought such a lease into a marriage was essentially bringing a significant, steady income stream. Her husband, through his absolute control over this chattel reel, gained instant access to that income and the power to liquidate that asset at will. This was an immediate and tangible form of financial power that deeply impacted the economic stability of the household, and critically, the economic vulnerability of the wife. This aspect of the law underscores how comprehensive the husband's control was. It wasn't just about the land she owned in the traditional sense or the trinkets she wore. It extended to every valuable interest she possessed, even those with long-term financial implications. The husband's power over chattel's real was a blunt instrument of control, allowing him to convert long-term assets into immediate cash, without any requirement for his wife's input or approval. It was another clear example of how the legal system of 1420 systematically placed all forms of a married woman's property squarely under the legal dominion of her husband, leaving her economically powerless within her own marriage. Number 6. Chattel's personal. Her movable wealth becomes his. This is where the law becomes truly stark, stripping away a married woman's individual ownership of virtually everything she could physically touch or hold. 1420 England, the moment a woman exchanged vows and became a wife, all her chattels personal became the absolute and undisputed property of her husband. This wasn't a temporary management right, it was an outright transfer of ownership. Her money, her jewels, her clothing, beyond a basic allowance for her person, her household goods, her animals, even her very furniture, everything she owned before marriage, and anything she acquired during it instantly became his. This was perhaps the most direct and universally applied form of control, leaving a married woman almost completely devoid of individual material possessions. Imagine a young woman named Catherine entering into marriage in 1420. For her wedding, Catherine might have had a small purse of coins she had saved from her work, perhaps a few pieces of silver jewelry inherited from her mother, a chest filled with her best gowns and cloaks, some cooking pots, and maybe even a milk cow she had been given as a child. In her unmarried state, as a femme soul, these were hers. She could sell them, use them, or cherish them as she wished. But on her wedding day, as she became a femme covert, all of these items instantly and irrevocably became the legal property of her husband, William. This was not a subtle legal point, it was a fundamental principle of common law. As legal scholars of the time would describe it, the husband acquired absolute ownership of his wife's chattels personal. He did not merely have a right to manage them, he owned them outright. He could sell Catherine's silver jewelry without her consent, even if it was a family heirloom. He could use her saved coins for his own purposes, without her input. He could even sell her cow or dispose of her fine clothing. Catherine would have no legal standing to object. Ownership simply ceased to exist, absorbed by her husband's legal persona. Legal texts from the medieval period, such as those that would later be synthesized by commentators like Coke and Littleton, clearly state this immediate and absolute transfer of personal property upon marriage. This principle extended to anything Catherine might acquire during her marriage. If she received a gift of money from a generous aunt, that money legally became William's the moment it was given. If she earned money through her own labor, for example, by selling eggs from their chickens or spinning wool, those earnings also instantly belonged to William. There was no concept of a married woman having her own separate income or personal savings. Every shilling, every fowl, every new garment that entered the household, whether through her own efforts or through a gift to her, was automatically absorbed into her husband's estate. This created a profound and complete economic dependency. Consider the emotional and practical implications of this. A woman might have a cherished piece of jewelry, a ring that had been passed down through generations of women in her family, holding deep sentimental value. Upon marriage, that ring became her husband's. Could, if he chose, sell it for coin, pawn it, or even give it to another woman. The emotional bond and the family history were entirely irrelevant in the eyes of the law. This forced women to rely entirely on the goodwill and generosity of their husbands for access to their own former possessions or any new acquisitions. If a husband was financially irresponsible, cruel, or simply had different priorities, a wife could find herself stripped of all personal wealth and possessions, left with nothing that was legally her own. There were very few, if any, exceptions for ordinary women. The concept of paraphernalia did exist, which generally referred to a wife's personal apparel and ornaments, often considered her own in a social sense. However, even these items were legally her husband's property during his lifetime. He could, theoretically, sell them, though it was rare for social custom to allow him to strip her of her essential clothing. Upon his death, if he had not sold them, these paraphernalia usually reverted to her, unless his estate was heavily in debt. During the marriage, the legal ownership remained with him. This distinction between social custom and legal right was crucial and often to the detriment of the wife. The comprehensive nature of this control over chattel's personal highlights the fundamental legal philosophy of 1420. A husband and wife were one person in law, and that person was the husband. The wife, as feme covert, had no independent legal capacity to own movable property. This legal reality profoundly shaped the daily lives of women. It meant they could not engage in independent trade, accumulate personal savings for their old age, or make financial decisions without their husband's ultimate authority. Economic agency was completely subsumed, ensuring that the husband remained the unchallenged master of the household's material wealth. This system, deeply embedded in common law, ensured that a married woman's movable wealth was not merely managed by her husband, but fully owned by him, leaving her with no legal claim to her own possessions. Number 7. Jure uxoris, the husband's lifelong claim to her land. Imagine owning a beautiful piece of land, perhaps a small farm passed down through your family for generations, or a valuable plot in a village. You've always known it was yours, a tangible symbol of your heritage and security. Then you marry, and suddenly, while the land might still bear your name in some old deeds, the legal right to manage it, to collect its rents, to decide its crops, and to live off its bounty, completely shifts to your husband for his entire life. This isn't about him co-owning it, it's about him gaining an absolute lifetime interest in its use and profits. This was the fundamental principle of jure uxoris, meaning by right of his wife, a powerful common law doctrine in 1420 England that gave husbands immense control over their wives' real property. Let's illustrate with the story of Isabella, a young woman in 1420 who inherited a small but prosperous manor from her father. This manor included a dwelling, fields, and perhaps a mill or a fish pond, providing a steady income. When Isabella married Edward, a gentleman from a neighboring shire, the legal landscape concerning her manor instantly transformed. While Isabella retained the seisin in right of his wife, meaning the underlying ownership, Edward, by virtue of their marriage, acquired seisin in right of himself and his wife. This legal phrase translates to Edward gaining the right to all the rents, services, and profits generated by Isabella's manor for the duration of their marriage. This wasn't a negotiable point. It was an automatic consequence of the common law marriage, as documented in authoritative legal texts of the period, such as those describing feudal land tenure. This meant Edward could manage the tenants, collect the rents, decide which crops would be planted, sell the timber from the woods, and generally make all the economic decisions concerning the land. Income derived from Isabella's manor became part of the marital estate, over which Edward had complete control. He could use these profits to pay his own debts, to support his other family members, or to invest in his own ventures, without requiring Isabella's consent or even her knowledge in many cases. Isabella, despite being the original owner, had no legal right to demand a share of the profits, or to dictate how the land was managed or its income spent. Her role was essentially passive in the economic operation of her own inherited estate. The husband's interest in his wife's real property, jure uxoris, lasted as long as the marriage endured. Edward died before Isabella. Her manor would revert fully to her control. This was one of the few instances where a married woman could regain full legal control over her property without legal intervention. However, if Isabella died before Edward, and they had a child born alive capable of inheriting her land, Edward's interest would transform into a more powerful and enduring right known as tenancy by the courtesy, as we discussed in a previous point, allowing him to keep the land for his lifetime even after her death. This illustrates the long-term reach of the husband's control over his wife's lands. While Edward couldn't typically sell Isabella's underlying freehold land without her consent, this protection was often more theoretical than practical. To sell the land, both Edward and Isabella would have to participate in a formal legal procedure known as a fine or fine and recovery. This procedure involved her being privately examined by a judge or court official, ostensibly to ensure she was giving her consent freely and not under coercion from her husband. However, the social pressures and realities of the time meant that such free consent was often heavily influenced, if not outright forced. A wife who refused might face severe consequences within her marriage and social circle. Records from medieval courts show countless instances of wives participating in such fines, suggesting that their consent was often a formality to enable their husband's transaction. Consider the impact on Isabella's sense of security and legacy. Her ancestral land, the very foundation of her family's standing, was under the complete management and financial exploitation of her husband. She could watch him make decisions she disagreed with, perhaps neglecting the land or mortgaging its future, and she would have no legal recourse to intervene. Children, the rightful heirs to her lineage, would have to wait for their father's lifetime interest to expire before they could truly take full possession of their mother's inheritance. This system effectively paused the direct transfer of property through the female line, inserting the husband as a lifelong intermediary. This legal mechanism of jure uxoris was central to the common law's view of marriage. It ensured that upon marriage, the husband became the undisputed head of the household, with broad economic control over all incoming wealth, regardless of its origin. It was not just about the money, it was about the fundamental power dynamics within a medieval marriage and the societal structure. The husband's lifetime claim to his wife's land meant that her inherited wealth primarily served to augment his status and resources, placing her in a position of complete economic dependence, even when she was theoretically a landowner. This was a striking example of how the common law of 1420 systematically placed power and property firmly in the hands of the husband, leaving the wife with little more than a nominal claim to her own inherited legacy. Number 8. Coverture, the grand legal erasure. Before we delve into specific ways husbands controlled wives' property in 1420, it's absolutely crucial to understand the fundamental legal concept that underpinned everything: coverture. Imagine if, the very instant you said, "I do," your legal identity, your capacity to own, to contract, to sue, or be sued essentially vanished. You, as an independent legal person, would cease to exist in the eyes of the law, becoming instead, in the legal jargon of the time, covered by your husband. This wasn't a metaphor, it was the chilling legal reality for married women in England in 1420. Coverture was the grand legal erasure, the foundational principle that made all other forms of husbandly control possible and legally justifiable. Think of it this way: before marriage, a woman was considered a feme sole, a single woman. As a feme sole, she possessed legal rights surprisingly similar to a man's in certain respects. She could enter into contracts, she could own property in her own name, she could sue and be sued in courts, and she could make a will. She was an individual legal entity, with her own distinct legal personality. The moment she married, she became a feme covert, a covered woman. Common law, the bedrock of the English legal system, viewed the husband and wife as one legal person, and that one person was the husband. And to covenant with her would be only to covenant with himself. While Blackstone wrote in the 18th century, he was describing legal doctrines firmly established and applied in 1420. This suspension, or incorporation, meant a profound loss of legal standing for the wife. Consider the immediate, sweeping consequences of this legal erasure for property. If a woman owned land or money before marriage, it didn't technically disappear, but her right to control it absolutely did. Her husband, by virtue of coverture, gained sweeping powers over her existing property and any property she might acquire during the marriage. He became the legal manager, decision-maker, and de facto owner of almost all marital assets. She lost her independent capacity to manage her own wealth because she was no longer seen as a separate legal entity capable of exercising those rights. For example, imagine a woman named Eleanor who owned a thriving weaving business before she married Thomas. As a feme sole, she made her own deals, bought her own wool, hired her own apprentices, and managed her own profits. The moment she married Thomas, the law declared that her business, her stock, her looms, and her earnings all became his. Eleanor, as feme covert, could no longer legally enter into business contracts independently. If she wanted to buy more wool, it would have to be Thomas who signed the agreement. Customer owed money, it would be Thomas who pursued the debt in court. Her entire economic livelihood was subsumed into his legal persona, giving him absolute authority over what was once her independent enterprise. Legal records from medieval English courts constantly reflect this, showing that suits involving married women's property or debts were always brought in the husband's name, or jointly with his wife. The doctrine of coverture extended far beyond mere property. It meant a married woman could not generally make a valid will concerning her personal property because it was no longer hers. She could not sue someone in court for damages unless her husband joined her in the lawsuit. She could not be sued for her own debts unless her husband was also named in the suit, making him responsible for her premarital financial obligations. She could not even enter into a binding contract without her husband's consent and often his direct involvement. Her voice in the legal world was silenced unless channeled through him. This was not a system designed for fairness or equality by modern standards. It was a system rooted in patriarchal societal norms and feudal economic structures, designed to consolidate power and wealth in the hands of the male head of household. By making the wife legally invisible, coverture ensured that all property, all earnings, and all legal transactions flowed through the husband, simplifying the legal administration of property and reinforcing the husband's dominance. This fundamental legal principle was consistently upheld in courts throughout England in 1420, serving as the bedrock upon which all subsequent legal controls over a wife's property were built. It was a complete and utter legal absorption, leaving the married woman with practically no independent legal identity in matters of property and finance.